Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and tonight we are sticking with the biggest story in the world right now, which is Donald Trump's trade war continuing to wreak havoc. We're also going to discuss whether the trade war that Trump started with China, he could lose. Could China actually win it? In the second half of the show, we'll discuss Parliament being recalled to debate steel nationalisation, and Donald Trump is proving too right-wing. And for Joe Rogan, of all people, so this is not a trade-related story. It's about a really disgraceful, actually, deportation that Trump did a while back. The Supreme Court have urged he change course. Do stay tuned for all of that. I'll be joined by Bastani in the second half of the show, I should let you know. I've got a Cambridge political economist in the first half. Before we get started, though, I'd like to remind you that we are currently hiring. Come work with us. We're looking for a person to work as a live stream producer. It is a great job. I'm sure we'll be putting a description in below this video. So do check that out and apply if you think that you might be an appropriate hire. Even if it was chaotic and completely unplanned, Donald Trump pulled a bit of a trick on Wednesday. That's because he ramped up his trade war with China to nuclear levels. But because at the same time he dropped tariffs on everyone else, the move was actually cheered by the financial markets. That's unusual. You blow up trade between the world's two biggest economic powers, and the financial markets say, brilliant, great. However, we're now 2 days later, and reality has very much kicked back in. Of course, whatever happens to US tariffs on the rest of the world, ending all trade between the world's two biggest economies will still do an awful lot of damage. And that's been made ever more obvious as Beijing makes clear it will not buckle first in this high-stakes game of chicken. So in response to Trump's tariffs of 145% on Chinese goods, China has now raised their tariffs on the US to 125%. And investors are once again getting jittery about the US economy. The dollar is down as investors are switching to gold, and movements in the bond market seem especially significant. You can see here the yield on 10-year Treasury bonds and how they've changed over the past 7 days. So hopefully you'll remember from Wednesday's show, yields on treasuries are the interest demanded by investors to buy US government debt. When the government is seen as more risky, that rate goes up. What you can see here is that from Monday, those rates massively increase, and then they spike again on Wednesday. Then Trump does his U-turn, so he goes back to the 10% tariffs on most of the world, and the rates fall when people's sort of confidence increases a bit. But they're back up again, and they're actually higher than they were at their Wednesday peak. Now, this seems very significant, as it was fears about a sell-off of treasuries that caused Trump to do his U-turn in the first place, and now they're being sold off again. So why are investors getting cold feet? Well, partly it's because they've belatedly realized the US government is run by an idiot. I could have told them that a few years ago. It's also, though, the continuing fear of a recession caused by a China trade war. And this interview with Beth Benike, founder and CEO of Busy Baby in Minnesota, shows why a recession could be incoming.
These tariffs mean I could potentially lose my house, lose my business, lose everything within about 3 to 4 months. There are so many small business owners and so many people are going through it on their own, and they're struggling as it is on a regular day. Now you are taking every single one of us and cutting out our legs from under us. Zero time to adapt and overcome and adjust to this. I'm happy to look into finding ways to bring some of my manufacturing back to the US, but I can't do it in the course of a day or a week. And now I can't even make a decision because everything's changing every 24 hours. So for us, we're just in this constant state of turmoil and depression and despair. And it's overwhelming. And I'm so worried. I'm worried for all of our business owners and their mental health.
So a trade war with China could put some firms out of business, as you saw there. And it will also hit consumers more generally. So according to researchers at Yale, the tariffs which are currently in place are expected to raise prices for American consumers by 2.9% overall, costing the average household almost $5,000 a year. And the price rise for some goods will be far steeper. So this here is from Bloomberg. It's a chart that shows some of the products made by China which the US is most reliant on. So as you can see, 86% of games consoles sold in the United States come from China, as do 79% of PC monitors, 76% of toys, and 73% of smartphones. So if all of those items essentially double in price overnight, that's not going to be pleasing to US consumers, and it will reduce the amount of money they have to spend on anything else, hence the fears of a recession. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is trying to set out how they will conduct negotiations with the Trump administration over the next 90 days. The EU's Ursula von der Leyen has said her favoured option would be zero tariffs between the US and Europe, but she's also warned that if talks fail, the EU is preparing to increase taxes on the ad revenue of American big tech, so Google, Facebook, and the like. Another country keen to keep tariffs low is Taiwan. They were due to be hit with 32% tariffs before Trump's U-turn. Their president has said today they will be one of the first countries to enter into talks with the US over tariffs. President Lai has said the island nation could import more American liquid natural gas in return for keeping tariffs low. To discuss where the world stands after a pretty crazy week, I'm joined by Jostein Hauge. Jostein is Assistant Professor in Political Economy and Development at the University of Cambridge and author of The Future of the Factory. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. To begin, was the market relief on Wednesday premature?
It's hard to say what's going to happen to markets these days. It's going up and down, like you said, almost like a yo-yo. What I think is particularly worrying here is that we have one person who's making all this market turmoil. I'm not sure if we've seen this before. It's quite unprecedented that the market reacts like this based on one person's decisions, one person's policies. So what I think is dangerous here is that we have one very unpredictable and, as you said, stupid person who's quite volatile making all this. So yes, in some, I do think the relief on Wednesday was a bit premature. We saw yesterday that the stock markets, especially the US-based stock indices, fell again. I do think as long as these tariffs stand, I do think as long as this trade war between China and the US escalates between these two massive superpowers who are the biggest players on the stage of world trade, as long as this trade war escalates, the markets are going to be down and it's going to be a volatile times.
And in terms of what sort of everyone is panicking about at the moment, is the bigger deal the 145% sort of tariffs on China, or is it the 10% tariffs on everyone else? Sort of what to you seems like sort of the bigger deal in terms of potentially pushing us into a recession?
I think they're both big deals. Obviously, let's start with the 145% tariff on China. We're talking about an extremely steep tariff here on the world's most important player in global trade, right? Now, the 10% tariffs on the rest of the world might seem small, but it also indicates something about US and President Trump's willingness to, so to speak, punish countries, many of whom haven't necessarily done anything to the US other than simply export their products to the US. So that's also quite significant, and it says something about what the US is willing to do. The fact that the US is willing to go after countries that have no quarrel with the US, the fact that President Trump we knew that he was all about America first, and to some extent his predecessors were too. But this is kind of now really, really seeing that President Trump doesn't really care much about how his actions impact the world economy.
And are there some countries that might be able to take advantage of the situation if it remains as it currently is, which is obviously a big if? So say I'm thinking of Vietnam or India. So if you've got a situation where there are these just crippling tariffs on China, so China basically can't export to the United States right now, does that mean that firms are going to sort of supercharge investment in countries like Vietnam and India, which still at the moment only have 10% tariffs on them because you can sort of produce at a similar cost to China, presumably, and then export to the US with only a 10% tariff instead of a 145% tariff? Are there some countries who might benefit from the situation as it currently is?
Well, I think the first major change we need to talk about is that I think most countries in the world that are not the United States of America is going to try to become less reliant on trade with the United States of America, given how volatile this administration seems to be. But you're asking a very important question here. Now, up until very recently, up until just a few days ago, Vietnam had these reciprocal tariffs slapped on them. Will they return? Who knows, right? So we can't say for sure if this situation that has been just existing for a few days with Vietnam is going to continue. We're not exactly sure what tariff rates on this booming economy in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. We're not exactly sure how steep they're going to be. India is also an interesting story because China has built really good trading relationship with a lot of countries in the world, especially the global south. But one economy that China has been more hesitant to build strong relationships with is India. So if, for example, the United States is somewhat successfully in trying to reduce China's competitiveness, then maybe India will benefit a little bit. However, China's economy is extremely strong on the global trade stage. So I don't think, and perhaps we'll go back to that in a few minutes, but I don't think in the long term China is going to suffer severely from this.
Yeah, we'll hone in on sort of the specific China question, who will win that trade war in a moment. First of all, I want your opinion on sort of the rest of the world, because obviously now we're in this situation where officially we've got a 90-day pause to the so-called reciprocal tariffs while negotiations take place. And countries like Taiwan have said we're very keen to enter into these negotiations, maybe willing to do some concessions on, say, we'll import a bit more liquid natural gas. The EU, I think, are more going for we'll punish you if you don't sort of make some deal with us. Are these negotiations even real? Because, I mean, the reason this 90-day pause happened wasn't to allow time for negotiations. It was because the markets were punishing America. So, like, Donald Trump was looking at the treasury rate go up. He panicked and said, oh, I have to U-turn. I have to step back. I have to back off from this. So I can't see a situation where in 90 days' time, I suppose it was presumably 88 days' time now, in 88 days, that Trump says, I haven't signed good enough deals, so I'm going to, go through this whole rigmarole again, where the market sort of threatened to cripple US Treasuries. So is this now just all for show, and the tariffs aren't going to get sort of raised again because Trump now knows what will happen if they do?
Who knows? We know a few things about Donald Trump. We know that, one, he loves tariffs, so we're going to keep seeing tariffs. Two, he's very volatile and unpredictable, so we don't know exactly what the level of tariffs is going to be. And three, is all about America first, and I would say American exceptionalism to a larger degree than his predecessor and his predecessors. Those are the three things we know for sure. What I would say is, I'm not so worried about these, say, for example, in Southeast Asia, which is a hub of global trade, like countries like Vietnam or Indonesia. These countries are now established strong in trade networks. And even though they export quite a bit to the US, they also have other big important trading partners. I'm more worried about the smaller countries in the global south. I'm more worried about countries like Lesotho, countries like Sri Lanka, right, who have relied heavily on the United States as an import destination for their products, right, and never really did anything to the United States other than exporting their products to the United States, right? They must be extremely worried right now because these are also relatively poor countries, right? And if they're put in a volatile situation, this has an impact on real people's lives and will push a lot of people into poverty very fast. So this is extremely reckless, I think, by Donald Trump to simply calculate these tariffs based on the trade deficits they have with the rest of the world. But, and this is a really important point, there is an upside to these tariffs because the world economy has been dominated by the United States for many, many decades. And sure, some countries have benefited a bit from this, but by and large, the United States have made sure that they have stayed on top of this hierarchy. Now we, the rest of the world, are daring to imagine a world economy where the United States don't have this hegemonic power anymore, that the United States is not the clear world number one. Now we can imagine and dare to think about a world economy where the balance of power is more evenly distributed across nations of the world, and maybe where we'll also see a stronger global South, which I'm very happy and optimistic about.
What would that concretely look like? Because, I mean, as you've just said, sort of in the near term, this trade war is going to be very damaging for countries in the global South whose development has in part been based on exporting to the United States, and some of those opportunities are now being closed off. I mean, in the medium or long term, what would a sort of fairer global trade sort of world system look like?
We can obviously talk about, say, trade blocks and things like that emerging between countries in the global South, which we're already starting to see. But let's talk about immediately what's going to happen to the directions of global trade, right? And China obviously is a really important player because China has been building trade relationships with the rest of the world very successfully now for way more than a decade. For example, if you look in African countries, 52 out of 54 African countries have a stronger trading relationship with China than they do with the United States. This was not at all the situation 15, 20 years ago. So we'll see a shift in trade where China becomes more central, where many countries in the South will negotiate more with China. I also think we'll see that European countries will start negotiating and building stronger trade relationships with China. I think we already saw Spain has indicated that they would like the European Union to pivot away from the US and more in the direction of China.
Let's move on specifically to this question of who would win this trade war if it continues to escalate. So stay with me, Jostein. The US-China trade war shows no sign of cooling. The Americans now have tariffs of 145% against Chinese goods, and China has slapped on 125% tariffs in return. And neither Donald Trump nor Xi Jinping look ready to back down. So if this trade war continues, who will come out on top? The Chinese government has put forward an image of confidence. This was the message released by their Ministry of Finance on Friday morning as they announced their final tariff hike. So they say, even if the US continues to impose higher tariffs, it will no longer make economic sense and will become a joke in the history of the world economy. At the current tariff level, there is no market acceptance for US goods exported to China. If the US continues to play the tariff numbers game, China will ignore it. However, if the US insists on continuing to substantially infringe on China's interests, China will resolutely counterattack and fight to the end. So they're sort of saying 125% is the last time we're going to raise the tariffs, because at 125%, we're not going to be importing anything anyway. So it'd be ridiculous to say, oh, now it's going to be 145. Now it's going to be 175. They're saying there isn't really much difference between these numbers anymore. But they are saying that if the United States uses a different measure to try and attack China, they will attack back. The Americans, though, claim that if the Chinese fight to the end, it's them who will lose. So Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent summed up that argument on Wednesday when the tit-for-tat was still just getting started.
Exports to the U.S. are 5 times our exports to China. So they can raise their tariffs, but so what?
And speaking on Thursday, Donald Trump responded with a joke to this question.
Mr. President, China retaliated today by reducing the number of American films that can be shown there. What's your reaction to them now targeting cultural exports from the United States?
I think I've heard of worse things.
Professor Jostein Hauge, who should be more relaxed about the US-China trade war, Trump or Xi Jinping?
Well, obviously, given the size of the tariffs here, right? The way we're seeing the tariffs escalate, these are steep tariffs, right, from both countries. Obviously, started here by the US. We should be clear about the trade war being started by the US this time around. Now, the US is slightly more dependent on imports from China than China is dependent on imports from the US. From that perspective, sort of purely from a mathematical trade perspective, the US certainly has reason to be more worried. This is going to impact both economies. Let me be clear about that. But we've already seen that it's impacting the US economy worse. Consumer confidence in the US is extremely low right now. The support for Donald Trump, even among Republicans, even among people who have voted for him, is extremely low right now. Consumers in the US are going to suffer. Businesses in the US are going to suffer. You know, big corporations like Ford, like Walmart, like Apple, like Tesla, in many ways, they have been made by China. So, China, over the past few years, have become completely integral to U.S. supply chain for U.S. consumption, and so on. So, the U.S., to sum up the answer to your question, although this is going to impact both economies negatively, Trump should be worrying much more than Xi, because this is already damaging the U.S. economy heavily, and the U.S. is going to be the biggest loser here.
Yeah, let's just get some clarity on this, because I think this is sort of somewhat confusing to understand, because the American position is it's the country who exports the most who is the most vulnerable, because sort of their opportunities to sell goods and make profits will be damaged more because China exports more to the US than the US exports to China. You're actually saying it's the country who imports more who could be more vulnerable. You said that the United States is more reliant on Chinese imports than China is reliant on American imports. Can you sort of cash that out? How should we be thinking about this?
Well, both the country that exports. So if the U.S. imposes tariffs, then both the U.S. as an importer should be somewhat worried, and China as an exporter should be somewhat worried. I do think, though, the degree of tariffs and the scale of tariffs matter here. The U.S. could have arguably in the past imposed tariffs in a more strategic manner to try and revive American manufacturing alongside subsidies, etc. But here, the scale of the tariffs is just so massive. And I had a look at these figures just before I came on to talk with you, Michael, and we've seen that the dependence that China has on exporting products to the US over the years has gone down. So out of China's entire export basket, around 11% of products go to the US. That's a high number, but it's lower than it used to be. Now, on the US side, out of all the products that they import, around 15% come from China, right? So from that perspective, it's clear that the US is going to suffer more. But we also have to consider that China's role in trade goes beyond just these numbers. China is involved in practically all global supply chains for goods, right? And the US needs to consider that when they start this kind of trade escalation with China. Now, another thing here to consider is, what is the goal here for the US to start this trade war? Trump has said reducing trade deficits. Okay, fine. You want to reduce the trade deficit. Maybe that's going to be healthy for the US economy, although they manage fine with the dollar as the reserve currency to manage that. Is it to bring American manufacturing jobs back? Really, does the US want all the manufacturing jobs that we've seen in the East Asian production ecosystem and the Southeast Asian production ecosystem? I think we've all seen these memes about workers in East Asia and Southeast Asia being replaced by American workers. These are not the manufacturing jobs, I think, really that the United States wants back.
Let's look at another clip of Donald Trump from that same sort of, I think it was a cabinet meeting with cameras in it that we showed a clip of earlier with the joke. This is, again, sort of Donald Trump speaking on Thursday about the China tariffs.
We would love to be able to work a deal. They've really taken advantage of our country for a long period of time. They've ripped us off beyond nobody. How people stood for it, sitting in my position, is not even believable. And we're talking about many presidents, not just a couple. But they did, and all we're doing is putting it back in shape. We're resetting the table. And I'm sure that we'll be able to get along very well. I have great respect for President Xi. He's been, in a true sense, he's been a friend of mine for a long period of time. And I think that we'll end up working out something that's very good for both countries. I look forward to it.
So a couple of things to note there. Trump sounded relatively open to negotiations with China. So I want to know how seriously you take that. First, though, can I get you to comment on sort of his more, I suppose, sweeping claim, which is that China has been ripping off the United States for years, for decades. What do you make of that? How do you respond to that idea that he is just righting a wrong which has been done to the US by China?
My answer to that is very clear. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. If anyone's benefited from this trade relationship, it's been the US. Sure, China has benefited in some ways, but if you look at the foreign company that's made the most profits from China's integration into globalization, it's Apple, an American company, right? And similarly, if you look at Tesla, where is the largest factory for this American electric vehicle? It's in Shanghai, China, right? This is deemed the most productive Tesla factory in the world right now. American consumers have benefited tremendously from all these cheap goods coming into their country. Access to a tremendous amount of cheap consumer goods, and as have people in the rest of the world, like you and I. So, America has come very, very well. Has come very, very well off this integration of China into the global economy. And sure, China has managed to use the trade relationship with the United States to benefit themselves, but this has been a struggle. A lot of long hours with low wages for a lot of people in China to basically serve American consumers and also in large part American firms. So, and this is why these tariffs are going to hurt America, because China has served the American economy massively for decades now.
I mean, whatever happens with the trade war, so if it escalates, if it sort of dampens down to some degree, a consequence of everything we've seen over the past especially the past 5 days, is that global markets, investors have lost a lot of faith in the United States, basically as a rational actor, I suppose. Many people suggesting this could sort of lead to a move away from the dollar as the global reserve currency. Could I get your thoughts on, I suppose, one, whether that's likely, and two, sort of who that would benefit? Is that something that China would celebrate?
If China strengthens its position in the world economy, even from financial terms and even in terms of a change in currency hierarchies, that would look to benefit China. But I think a lot would have to happen for the US dollar to lose its position as the international reserve currency. The US dollar has been the international reserve currency for many, many decades. I don't think we're likely to see the strength of the dollar, or let's say the strength of the dollar might go down, but the position of the dollar, I think, as the international reserve currency will remain. If that's not the case, we're talking about a complete restructuring of the international economic order in a very unprecedented way. So I've made quite sweeping statements about how I think the world trade is going to be shifting away from the US, and I stand by that. But I do still think that the US dollar will remain a very important currency in international trade for a few years.
So people in the comments are saying there's 2 Michael Walkers tonight, so I'll let you go and give them some variety in a moment. Before I do that, could I find out from you what you think are sort of the key moments we should be looking out for in terms of how the US-China trade war develops? What are sort of, is there a moment where this could further escalate? What could lead to some kind of de-escalation?
We simply have to, and this is probably what Trump likes, that everyone follows his every single move every day. And he unfortunately has a lot of power into determining the direction of the world economy. So what he does will dictate a lot here. I think China has turned out to be a more predictable trading partner. So and they are more clear about what they want. So I don't think it's too difficult to predict exactly what China is going to do. But as more time passes, we will see more clearly where Trump is going to go. But again, we know three things about Trump. We know that he loves tariffs. We know that he is volatile, and we know that he doesn't really give a crap about if he sort of flushes the world economy down the toilet, right? Those are the three things we do know. But he also cares about how strong support for him is. So, he probably isn't fond of seeing stock markets going down. He probably wants to retain some support among the Republicans for him. So, he'll have to manage this much better in the months to come.
Jostein, Hauge, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Great to speak to you.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I really enjoyed it.
Aaron, welcome to the show. A lot has happened since your last show on Tuesday. What have you made of what's happened since then? Been very dramatic.
What do I make of it? It's interesting. I've spoken to two friends, Michael, and both in business. One said he's been on a few earning calls in the last couple of days, and people aren't worried about markets, right? That's not the thing that matters, whether the FTSE goes up or down, within reason, obviously. They're worried about the investment environment. And if you are Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund or Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund or Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund or a major investor or an asset manager, you're not going to allocate large amounts of money anywhere when there is so much volatility and you have no real idea what's going on. Now, the big problem for those guys is that doesn't change after 90 days, even if there is some kind of resolution here. This is the Trump modus operandi. I think people forgot how bad he is with this stuff, right? I mean, we saw it, it was really bad during COVID. There's a reason why Joe Biden beat him, right? Even though his numbers actually were very impressive 6-12 months out from that election in 2020. So I think a lot of people who maybe supported him, didn't necessarily vote for him because they're not US nationals, but supported him, perhaps had a bit of time for some of his criticisms of various things, woke, identity politics, whatever. People who want to trigger the libs are kind of realizing that actually really big things are at stake and they could lose their pensions or their business could go under, or best case, this year's earnings aren't much to talk about, and maybe next year's and maybe the year after. I had another friend as well who was, quite positive about Trump. Not anymore. Not anymore, because I think lots of these people thought it was just talk, and they liked the culture war-y social attitude stuff, but they thought in the economy it was just talk. And we saw this really with Bill Ackman, Michael. We played a few clips of Bill Ackman. He's a big investment guy. He's head of an investment fund in the US. He was involved in culture war stuff with Harvard University over Israel, Gaza. Big backer of Trump. He's a CEO, I think, of Pershing Capital Management. And we saw Bill Ackman a few months ago saying this is going to be great for the stock market. We're going to see it go to record highs, which stock market did really, really well under Trump 1.0. This is a different kind of Trump with Pete Navarro, far more propositional with what he wants to do with US trade, reindustrialization. He said all of this, by the way. These people never thought he'd actually do it. And I think that's the story of the last 4 or 5 days. These people didn't think he'd actually do it. And I think many of them probably regret voting for him, and they would have voted for Kamala Harris. They'll whine about the woke stuff or whatever over a glass of Pinot Noir in their Californian mansions, but fundamentally they don't want to lose lots of money, and that's ultimately what this man may represent for them. Although he can course correct. I think he will course correct. I think he's learned a very big lesson the hard way.
And what's your read on where the specific trade war between the US and China will go? I mean, because some people were sort of reading what happened on Wednesday as, this is a bit of a pivot. So before there was this sort of kind of arbitrary plan where you just put tariffs on everyone because you don't want any kind of trade deficits. But there were lots of people who were saying it would actually be sensible to have a bit of a trade war with China so long as you shore up your own allies. So people were seeing, maybe this is a strategy that makes sense. I sort of looking at how reliant America is on certain Chinese imports, I can't see this trade war continuing at this level. I think there has to be some kind of stepping back from it. I don't know what you think.
No, that's right. It's really important to say as well, Michael, the US has been waging a trade war against China for quite a while. We saw, major tariffs in regards to certain goods. We've seen, debates since they joined the WTO. There's been a conversation about the Chinese currency being undervalued. We saw the CHIPS Act under Biden. We saw IRA. A big part of that was fundamentally about deindustrializing Europe and reindustrializing the United States to be competitive in leading edge technologies like semiconductor manufacture, lithium-ion batteries, et cetera, et cetera. The US was doing this. And by the way, that was a really clever strategy. It was really working. The US was reindustrializing under Biden. It wasn't creating many jobs because modern manufacturing doesn't create many jobs. But if you actually look at quite a few important indices for manufacturing output, things were going pretty well under the Biden admin. Now, major deficits were being used. Lots of debt was being added to the US ledger. You might say, well, it wasn't worth it. Actually, it's not real growth, etc. But there was a strategy there, and it seemed to be working. You were making the European Union dependent on US exports of liquid natural gas as well. Like, there was a real strategy there. Reindustrialize, try and undermine China's edge in things like, semiconductors and whatnot, and try and return leadership of those technologies to the United States. Now, was it working sufficiently well? Not really. China was surviving those things. And so you can see why even a Democrat president, again, I don't agree with this policy formula, just to be clear, but you can see why a Democrat president, given all that, might have escalated things, Michael. I totally get that. You double down on the CHIPS Act, you increase tariffs on Chinese EVs, you increase tariffs on Chinese PV cells, you increase tariffs on certain goods from China. Why on earth would you place a tariff on South Korea, Japan? These are your biggest allies in East Asia. It makes no sense. Why on earth would you put massive tariffs on Vietnam? Now, to some extent, you might say, well, that's because you want to reindustrialize the US heartlands. But there's a geopolitical element as well, which is you're trying to tear away Vietnam from China. You want them in the US sphere of influence. I fundamentally think that Trump is undermining decades of US statecraft. Personally, I could be wrong, of course. We're all wrong about lots of things lots of the time. But I'll finish with this. If you look at GDP by PPP, so not nominal GDP, and you might say, well, that's the way we should measure things, but GDP, PPP, the United States is about 15, its economy is about 15% of global economic output. China's about 20% of global economic output. ASEAN and Africa between them are about 10%. The BRICS are about 35%. So if you add ASEAN, which is East Asian countries, mostly smaller ones, plus the BRICS, plus, which of course includes China, plus Africa, you're looking at something like 45% of global GDP. The US is 15%, right? So I'm not even talking about South America. I'm not talking about Europe. I'm not talking about Australasia. The idea that the Chinese economy could be crippled because of tariffs to an economy which is only 15% of global GDP, again, PPP, not nominal GDP, I think seems somewhat short-sighted. And the big deal here, Michael, is the Europeans. The Europeans, including Britain, the EU, Norway, etc., is about 21% of the global economy. So it's actually a larger share of the global economy by this particular measure than the United States. Now, if the US can somehow tear Europe away from Chinese imports, okay, now you're talking. That requires incredible statecraft, and it would require the Europeans to swallow a hell of a lot of inflation. They just did that because they withdrew from dependence on Russian energy. They're not going to do the same thing right away with Chinese consumer durables and electronic gadgets. So my instinct tells me this is worse for the US than it is for China. That said, it's not good for China, and it may prove disruptive in terms of the domestic political context. Who knows? There are lots of known knowns and unknown unknowns. And I think there's lots of unknown unknowns, particularly on the Chinese side. But at face value, I think it's a worse set of circumstances for the United States.
Sometimes we have a Friday night debate night, but I agree with you 100% there. So we're going to go on to our next story. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. The House of Commons will sit on Saturday for the first time since 2019 for an emergency debate on the renationalisation of British steel. The bill will give Keir Starmer power to direct steel companies in England, and it will be used to stop Chinese firm Xingye from closing Britain's last 2 blast furnaces in Scunthorpe. The GMB union, who represent many workers in the plant, have welcomed the move. So they say the business secretary must be given huge praise for acting decisively to safeguard this vital industry and the thousands of jobs that rely on it. The Guardian has a bit more information about the plant in question. So they say Scunthorpe is the last remaining steelworks capable of making steel from iron ore, and so is seen by some people as strategically important for the UK. However, Xingye last month said it planned to close the plant's 2 blast furnaces, putting 2,700 jobs at risk. It has since refused to pay for new raw materials, with coal and iron ore deliveries to Immingham port not yet paid for. The government had offered £500 million in financial support to switch the blast furnaces to cleaner electric arc furnaces, but Xingye had requested much more. Talks this week are thought to have stalled when Xingye balked at the conditions attached to the offer to pay for new raw materials. Some people are suggesting this could be somewhat related to the tariff war, because there is a 25% tariff on steel exports from the UK to the United States. But obviously British steel has been on a bit of a downward spiral for quite a while now. Aaron, obviously, if the government do renationalise British steel, it's not really from sort of any enthusiasm about nationalisation. It's because the private firm that owns it doesn't want to run it anymore, essentially. They seem to think it's not profitable, so they're simply saying, we're not going to buy any more of the raw materials. This is closing down. Government are coming in as a last resort to take it over. What's your reaction?
I mean, the story of the British steel industry, Michael, is quite extraordinary. In the 19th century, Sheffield, one city, produced about 80% of global steel. One city at the apogee of the Industrial Revolution. Modern steel manufacture actually starts with a gentleman, I believe, called Henry Bessemer, who makes major innovations in the opening decades of the 19th century, which makes it a really commercially viable technology, modern steel. And yet now Britain is absolutely nowhere on this stuff. Absolutely nowhere. And that was not an iron law of history and politics. You might say, well, we've got expensive energy. We would always struggle to produce steel. Well, we've got lots of coal, and it's abundant and it's cheap. And we shouldn't be using coal for electricity. And as part of our energy grid, we should be using it to make steel, at least for now, at least the next decade or two. You also need steel, by the way, if you want an energy transition. I don't really see why we can't have a successful energy steel industry in this country. You look at some of the other big players, Japan, South Korea, they don't have particularly cheap energy. So, there's no iron law here. By the way, as well, South Korea, the amount of shipbuilding South Korea does, extraordinary amounts of shipbuilding they make. I think more than the United States, far more than the United States. It's not a big country. It's 35 million people. These are all industries that the UK gave up on because of neoliberalism and adopting basically the mantras of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. Gave up on them. Now, it doesn't mean if those guys hadn't been on the scene that Britain would have a world-beating, steel manufacturing industry and shipbuilding. It could have. There's another world where those industries were managed in a different way between the state and the market, and they were very successful. They were competitive. They created lots of good jobs. There is a world where that was the case. It's political failure for the most part. And in terms of these 2 last blast furnaces that we have in Scunthorpe, I think really, if you're spending £60 billion a year on defence spending, Michael, £60 billion, that's before Keir Starmer's latest splurge. It's wild to be spending all that money on F-35s and Trident, etc., and not have a single domestic steel foundry. Now, I know many of our listeners, viewers, don't really care to hear those arguments, but I think that's why they will be nationalised ultimately, because you cannot conduct warfare, national self-defence, without a domestic steel industry. And if we lose this, and I don't mean electric arc furnaces, I mean blast furnaces like this. These are the last 2 in the country, in Scunthorpe. Without that ability, you basically can't do wartime rearmament. You can't do it. So I think that's why they ultimately will be nationalised. I personally would nationalise them anyway. There's probably an argument actually for very low tariffs on imported steel from other parts of the world. This is something we can do. We're no longer in the European Union, to at least keep some capacity going. But it's interesting when you talk to people about this stuff. Well, why can't we have a world-class steel industry in this country? And you don't get a good answer. Like, we've got lots of really smart people. We've got a history of making the stuff. We've got lots of coal. We've got lots of know-how. You tell me why we can't. You tell me why we can't. And I think part of the answer is that we've basically lost confidence in making anything in this country. We don't train people to make things in this country anymore. We know what, maybe all the intelligent young people that we currently direct towards finance and towards other industries in the quote unquote service sector, maybe actually we need a massive rethink about where we send our smartest people. I would submit it should not be into the financial service industry. It should be into things like aerospace, steel manufacture, energy, life sciences, healthcare. That's what I would argue for. But we are where we are. And I think renationalisation will happen, which is a good thing. But it'll happen for reasons that the left, generally speaking, isn't very positive about.
Which is sort of, you only take it over once it's a loss-making business. Whereas, maybe it'd be nice for the state to sometimes take over something when it's doing kind of well, so we don't just get the losses. But there we are. I think one of the reasons we couldn't have it is because Margaret Thatcher thought that all heavy industry was too unionised, so she wanted to destroy it in favour of service sector jobs, which were less unionised, right? The political strategy was partly just to destroy organised labour, to deindustrialise, especially the north of England. But then I suppose you could also talk about sort of the model of capitalism and training, etc. But I agree with you on that as well. The US Supreme Court has ordered the Trump administration to help return a migrant they wrongfully deported to a notorious jail in El Salvador. The case of 29-year-old Kilmar Abrego Garcia had shocked much of America and the world. The man who had the right to be in the United States and who has an American wife and son was picked up in March and deported to a Salvadorian jail. The White House went on to admit he had been sent wrongfully, but refused to allow him to return, as this report from early March explained.
Tonight, the Trump administration acknowledging this man was inadvertently sent to a notorious mega prison in El Salvador because of an administrative error. Lawyers for the Salvadorian man, Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, identified in these prison video screen grabs by his U.S. citizen wife, are petitioning for his immediate return. They say Abrego Garcia was removed against a 2019 judge's order, preventing him from being sent back to his home country. The White House, though acknowledging the oversight, unapologetic.
It was an administrative error. The administration maintains the position that this individual who was deported to El Salvador and will not be returning to our country was a member of the brutal and vicious MS-13 gang.
Abrego Garcia's family says he's no gang member and have heard nothing about his condition for weeks, saying this has been, quote, a nightmare.
So that position from the American government, that the man was wrongfully deported, but that he still couldn't come back, that was challenged in a federal court in Maryland, and on April the 4th, a federal judge ordered that he be returned. That decision was appealed by the Trump administration, but the Supreme Court has now also ruled that Abrego Garcia must be returned.
The court said in an unsigned order with no noted dissents, quote, the order properly requires the government to, quote unquote, facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador, and to ensure his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. So, like I said, this is breaking right now, and this was a unanimous order by the Supreme Court, 9-0.
The fact the court came to a unanimous decision that Trump was wrong seems significant, given he appointed 3 members of the Supreme Court. So what happens now? Well, Trump has never appeared too fussed about what judges tell him to do. But if he were to attempt a standoff with the American legal system, it's unclear that on this issue it would work in his favour. Joe Rogan and Konstantin Kisin spoke about a similar case on a recent episode of The Joe Rogan Show. So both of them supported Trump last November. But this is their take on the shocking case of a gay Venezuelan makeup artist wrongly deported to an El Salvadorian prison.
31-year-old makeup artist falsely deported to El Salvador prison, lawyer says. Immigration attorney say a gay Venezuelan makeup artist seeking asylum in the U.S. was wrongly detained as a gang member and deported to El Salvador, a case becoming a flashpoint in the debate over the Trump administration's deportation of hundreds of migrants to a notoriously inhumane El Salvador mega prison. Man. So again, it's hard to know.
It's hard to know
what's real and what's not real. But if it is real, this is fucking horrible.
But if you think about it, Joe, like I say, if you're rounding up hundreds of people, mistakes are going to get made because everyone's human. And you then have to have a system, I think, that allows you to amend and make adjustments for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can't be bury your head in the sand and pretend it didn't happen.
No.
Yeah.
And this is the trouble with government. The incentive structure is all wrong. Like, to admit that is now embarrassing.
That's crazy.
Right.
So the mistakes like that have to be corrected if you want reasonable people to be on board with you.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. If you want, compassionate people to be on board with you, you can't deport gay hairdressers seeking asylum. That's fucking crazy. Yeah. And then throw them in an El Salvador prison. That's
not even his country.
Right.
You deport people back to their country.
Right. It's nuts.
So that case was a slightly different one, but to the same prison. And you heard there sort of the people in that conversation, so Konstantin Kisin and Joe Rogan, sort of saying, if a mistake is made, you have to correct it. Whereas Donald Trump was saying in the case that we began this segment with, we did deport this father mistakenly. It was an administrative error, but they still can't be returned. As I say, the Supreme Court have now overturned that decision. Will Trump do a standoff given that even his fairly right-wing supporters think he's in the wrong? Aaron, what's your take on this?
I think we're going to see more of this, Michael. We saw it a little bit with a debate on Joe Rogan with Douglas Murray. That there is a real tension, really, right now over the individual liberty stuff, free speech stuff, the idea of the state being a necessary evil, that classical liberal kind of view of it, which I think Konstantin Kisin and Joe Rogan probably have. Not that they have the same politics. I think Joe Rogan is quite left-wing on some things, actually. He favors a single-payer healthcare model, for instance, but there is an instinctive libertarianism there in his politics. I think, there is a huge tension in the Trump project and corralling the right around it, and more besides, in so much as you're talking about free speech, and then you are literally arresting student activists at various universities across the country who have the right to be in the US, who are studying in the US, for writing something down, for an opinion, not even for a protest in certain cases, okay? Those people are now being arrested, and yet their right to free speech should be protected under the First Amendment. It's the same with regards to due process and the right to appeal, etc. These are all sacrosanct liberties for anybody who cares about freedom. But at the same time, Trump doesn't really believe in that stuff. And his political style his idiom is that of a strongman. His project is that of a strongman. Marco Rubio saying, I can't find people quickly enough to throw them out. That is not somebody who particularly cares about due process and making sure you're getting things right, even if your project isn't particularly praiseworthy, at least by the conventions and norms of fairness and impartiality, getting things right, which they're not doing. So I think there's a massive tension there, Michael, within the right. And look, for a while, because of their resistance to the perceived left-wing project of wokeness and high inflation, etc., there was this beautiful moment where it all crystallized and Trump could get an electoral majority. I don't mean electoral college, I mean a majority of Americans, which Republicans hadn't got since 2004. Since 2004 elections. The first time since 2004, Republican candidate got a majority of votes in an election. Not majority of the population, but a majority of people that voted in the most recent presidential election. And I think it's going to be quite hard to hold that coalition together when you have these really, really strong tensions of people that want centralized and coercive authority and people that believe in civil liberties. And I still, whatever you think of the American right, broadly speaking, I still think they tend towards the latter, particularly the American populist right. I don't mean the organizations and the politicians. I mean just people. Watching that debate, for instance, yesterday between Joe Rogan and Douglas Murray and a third person, a comedian, it was very obvious to me that the style of Douglas Murray was really at odds with the folk politics, which underpinned a lot of Trumpism, for better and worse. I'm a free individual. I can say what I like. There don't have to be consequences. Well, sometimes you shouldn't just be able to say what you like around, polio vaccines, actually. But broadly speaking, free speech is a good thing. And I watched that, and I looked at Douglas Murray, and he came across as censorious and hectoring. And I'm thinking, these guys do not belong under the same political tent. They really are in different worlds. And I think on a lot of issues, Michael, right to protest, like I say, First Amendment, free speech, Israel, I think you're going to see time after time tax cuts for the rich, which will happen, right, at some point. Allegedly, these tariffs are going to pay for capital gains tax to be abolished, allegedly. I mean, although these tariffs aren't probably going to be around for much longer. I think on a lot of these issues, that Trump coalition is really going to fray. The good news, of course, for Trump and Republicans is that the Democrat Party don't have an alternative. They don't have an alternative. And I wouldn't be that surprised if Kamala Harris ran again in the next election. I really wouldn't be that surprised. Who have they got? Maybe Gavin Newsom. Maybe somebody will emerge in the next 3 years. A lot can change. But I think right now that's the best asset that Trump has is the caliber, or rather lack of caliber, when it comes to the political opposition.
I was just looking at the favorability ratings because I was thinking surely Donald Trump is taking a hit after all of this. And he is, his favorability ratings aren't great compared to other US presidents, but still 45% of people have a positive sort of image of him in the United States. You compare that to Keir Starmer, 29% of Britons hold a favourable view of the Prime Minister, 46% are unfavourable. Now, I'm not a big fan of Keir Starmer, but that does seem unfair to me, right? You can completely crash the global economy. You can deport a bunch of people due to an administrative error, all the other nonsense he's done. And still, 45 to 52, that's not bad, is it? That's more popular than I think a British Prime Minister has been in about a decade.
Yes, it is popular. And there's a few things to say about that, Michael. So, for instance, with the market panic, people are worried about the markets and, all that red. No, lots of working class Americans don't care about the stock market. They don't have pensions and tracker ISAs and, what do they have in the US? They have tracker ISAs. They don't have delayed deferred wealth tied up in pensions, which are, indexed to the stock market. I mean, many people do, but lots of regular people don't in the kinds of states that Trump now counts on. I think the big problem with the Trump alliance, Michael, is less the quantity of people, but what they would view as the quality. I think elite Americans in business, in technology, who did back him are having really serious second thoughts about it. I think Bill Ackman was just a classic example of that. Elon Musk, Michael, this was another clip from last week. Elon Musk is talking about wanting an open free market for labor between North America and Europe. Did you actually listen to anything that Donald Trump said? He wants to disintegrate the idea of a common economic zone across North America, let alone join one with the European Union. So I think he might struggle with elite support more than, more working class support of the kind recently, by the way, that we encountered. We did a great documentary. Richard Hames went over there talking to regular Americans who backed Donald Trump, asking them why. No, I agree with you. He's not lost those people so far. Quickly on Starmer, it's kind of crazy. I did see one poll which basically showed that I think the majority of the public now thinks that Labour is enacting austerity, which is as bad as what happened under the Tories and the Liberal Democrats. That strikes me as possibly the worst political messaging outcome imaginable. Your whole line is that we're better than the Tories and the Lib Dems, because those guys did austerity. But now a majority of the public thinks that what you're doing is just as bad. By the way, it isn't. It just isn't. I'm not a fan of what they're doing, but it just isn't. And that's because for months, Labour have been telling the public how bad things are, how they're going to cut things, how this is necessary and it has to happen. But you were voted on a platform of change, right? And so I think actually in a way, Michael, I think the Starmer government, how they're governing so far, it's almost like an experiment to see how can you become as unpopular as quickly as possible. I'm being serious. It's hard to imagine a better experiment here. You saw it with the changes with regards to funding for grooming gang reports in various local authorities this week. Every week there's a new comms screw up. Every single week. And look, maybe things change. We had some good data today on GDP, monthly growth of 0.5%. It's just 1 month. I always say that, for better or worse. It's just 1 month. But that's a good data point for the government. But so far, it's really like they've tried their hardest to get less than 100 seats in the next election. By the way, if they carry on like this, they will. I find it hard to believe they will carry on like this. I think people will probably get a new leader before that happens. But you saw in a by-election yesterday, them losing to a reform candidate in one part of the country. I think the swing was like 25% odd. And in London, they lose to a Green candidate, a similar swing. And, your vote is going to be nibbled on by all sides. It's going to be nibbled on by Reform, by the Greens, by the Lib Dems, by the SNP, by Plaid Cymru. It's a real problem for Labour. And I don't see a plan. So I'm not surprised at the polling numbers. But you're right. It's pretty amazing that they're so much worse than Trump's.
I mean, Trump's will be a bit worse after this week because people, will have seen. I mean, there might be a number of people who sort of think that their pensions have gone down now that the stock markets have tanked or whatever, but we'll see. In any case, they probably won't go lower than Keir Starmer, so that point will remain. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Oh, it's just been great to be reunited with you, Michael. And the first half of the show with Jostein was a Michael Walker masterclass. Long may it continue.
Thank you very much. You're too kind, Aaron. You're too kind. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in as well. Come back on Monday for another live show at 6 p.m. Have a great weekend. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.